She didn't cry when she told me she was leaving, which is how I knew it wasn't a fight I could win, because tears would have meant doubt, hesitation, some last fragile thread I could pull on. But instead, she stood in the doorway of our bedroom with a suitcase already zipped, posture straight, voice steady, eyes strangely calm, and said my name the way you do when you've rehearsed something too many times to back out now. The house felt suspended in that moment, like it was holding its breath, and I remember noticing ridiculous details: the low hum of the fridge, the way the light from the hallway cut across her face, before the words landed and rearranged everything I thought I knew. She said she'd reconnected with someone from college, an ex she hadn't talked about in years, and the way she said it made it sound less like a confession and more like an explanation she'd already given herself permission to believe. She didn't frame it as cheating, didn't use the word affair, just said they'd been talking, reminiscing, laughing about old stories, and that it had reminded her of who she used to be, of a time when things felt easier, more certain, more alive. When she said she wanted something familiar, the phrase scraped against me, because familiarity was what we had built together, years of routines and shared mornings and sex that wasn't frantic anymore but deep and known, the kind that comes from understanding someone's body as well as your own. I asked her when this had started, and she didn't answer directly, just said it had been building for a while, which felt like another way of saying I'd been living in the dark while she was already halfway out. There was confidence in her now that hadn't been there recently, a decisiveness that didn't come from sudden inspiration, but from a choice made quietly and reinforced over time. And I realized I was watching the end of something that had already ended for her weeks, maybe months ago. She said she wasn't trying to hurt me, that she just needed to be honest, and the word honest nearly made me laugh, because honesty delivered this late feels a lot like cleanup. I followed her down the hall as she moved through the house like a guest checking out, touching nothing, lingering nowhere. And when she stopped at the door, she hesitated just long enough to make me wonder if she might turn around, if the weight of what she was doing might finally hit her. But instead, she looked back at me with an expression that mixed apology and resolve, and said she hoped I'd understand someday. That was when it hit me hardest, not the loss, but the certainty that she believed this was the right thing, that whatever guilt she carried wasn't strong enough to slow her down. When the door closed behind her, the sound was softer than I expected, almost polite, and the silence that followed felt unnatural, too wide for one person to fill. I stood there for a long time, staring at the place where she'd been, replaying her words, her calm, her certainty, and beneath the shock, there was something else beginning to stir, a sense that this hadn't come out of nowhere, that the familiarity she was chasing had been fed to her carefully, deliberately, by someone who knew exactly how to position himself as the past she never fully let go of. I didn't know it yet, not really, but as I sank onto the edge of the bed we'd shared hours earlier, sheets still carrying the faint warmth of sex that now felt like a lie, I understood one thing with uncomfortable clarity. She hadn't just left me for another man. She'd left me for a version of herself she thought she could reclaim, and that belief was going to cost all of us more than any of us realized. I didn't meet him right away, not in person, but he made himself present almost immediately, slipping into my life through the gaps she left behind, because within days of her moving out, she stopped saying I when she talked and started saying we, and every time she did, I knew whose voice was guiding hers. When I finally saw him, it was at a cafe she insisted we meet at to talk logistics, and he was already there when I arrived, seated beside her as if that seat had always belonged to him, hand resting casually on the back of her chair in a way that was meant to look protective but felt territorial. He stood when I approached, smile wide, posture confident, dressed like someone who knew exactly how he wanted to be perceived, successful, relaxed, untouchable, and he said my name like we were old friends rather than strangers bound by a shared betrayal. He talked easily, almost effortlessly, filling the space with stories about college days I'd never been part of, about how she used to laugh more back then, how she'd always been too good for the life she settled into, and I noticed how she nodded along, eyes bright in a way I hadn't seen in months, as if she were watching herself through his approval. When I tried to speak, to ground the conversation in reality, he would gently interrupt, rephrasing my words, reframing them until they fit his narrative. And it became clear quickly that this wasn't an accident. This was how he operated, smoothing over inconvenient details, steering conversations where he wanted them to go. There was a moment when he leaned back and said, almost nostalgically, that timing had always been their problem, that life had gotten in the way back then, careers, expectations, other people. And he glanced at me when he said that last part, just briefly, like I was an obstacle that had finally been cleared rather than a person whose marriage he'd stepped into. My wife didn't correct him, didn't push back. She just looked at him with a softness that hurt to witness. And I felt something twist in my chest that had nothing to do with jealousy and everything to do with being erased in real time. What unsettled me most wasn't his confidence. It was how practiced it was, how easily he played the role of the man who got away, the one who represented possibility rather than responsibility, and I could see how intoxicating that must have been for her, especially after years of shared bills and routines and sex that had become less about discovery and more about comfort. He talked about freedom, about knowing what you want, about not settling, and each phrase landed like it had been designed specifically for her ears, and I realized she wasn't just choosing him, she was choosing the story he was selling. When the conversation ended, he shook my hand firmly, held my gaze a second longer than necessary, and told me he hoped there were no hard feelings, because this wasn't personal. It was just life unfolding the way it was meant to, and that was when I understood the real danger he posed. He didn't see himself as a villain, or even as a participant in someone else's pain. He saw himself as inevitable, as destiny correcting a mistake, and people who believe that will justify almost anything. As I watched them walk away together, her leaning slightly into him, his hand settling at the small of her back with casual familiarity, I felt the last illusion crumble, because this wasn't a reckless affair or a moment of weakness. It was a carefully curated replacement, and the man she chose wasn't just stepping into my place. He was rewriting the past to make it look like I'd never really belonged there at all. The first week after she left, I kept catching myself reaching for my phone the way you reach for a railing on stairs you've walked 1,000 times, and every time I stopped myself, I felt this small jolt of humiliation because I wasn't chasing her. I was chasing normal. She'd been gone for days, yet her toothbrush was still in the cup. A sweater still hung on the chair like it had simply forgotten to leave, and I kept telling myself I'd clean it all up later, because cleaning felt like admitting the space she'd occupied was now empty for good. At night, the bed was the worst part. Not because I couldn't sleep, but because my body kept expecting her. The familiar weight, the warmth, the quiet after sex when she'd lie with her head on my chest and talk about nothing. And then I'd roll over and the other side would be cold and untouched, and I'd feel angry at myself for missing someone who'd walked out so calmly. But what started bothering me wasn't just the loneliness, it was the way her story kept shifting every time we spoke, as if she were reading it off a screen she couldn't quite remember. She'd call to coordinate paperwork or sort out the bills, and she'd say the same phrases again and again, almost word for word, like she was practicing lines. I need to honor my truth. I'm choosing what's aligned. This isn't about you. And none of that sounded like her. My wife used to be blunt, even when she was wrong. She didn't talk like a motivational poster. When I challenged her, when I asked her to explain what exactly had been missing in our marriage, she'd dodge and repeat those phrases, and I'd feel the eerie certainty that I wasn't arguing with her anymore. I was arguing with him through her. The more I listened, the more I noticed the pattern. She'd talk in a bright, confident tone when she mentioned him, like someone had plugged her into a power source. But when I asked practical questions, she'd get vague, impatient, almost irritated that reality kept interrupting the fantasy. And his life, the way she described it, sounded too perfect in a way that made my skin itch. He was so busy, yet always available to answer when she needed reassurance. He was so successful, yet never seemed to have deadlines that pulled him away. He traveled constantly, but his stories were oddly generic, always centered on how people admired him, how things fell into place for him, how the world seemed to reward him for being who he was. I started looking at what she posted, not because I wanted to torture myself, but because it was the only window I had into what was happening, and the posts were curated like a magazine spread. Carefully angled photos, flattering lighting, captions that sounded like she was auditioning for a new identity, and always, little hints of him without showing too much. A blurred hand on a table, a glass raised across from hers, the edge of a watch in the corner of a frame. It felt intentional, like a teaser, and I couldn't tell whether she was doing it for her friends or for me, until I noticed something else. The comments, the way certain people responded, the way one particular account always liked within minutes, always left a line that sounded supportive without saying anything concrete. It wasn't affectionate, it was strategic, like he was keeping the narrative tidy. The strangest part was how quickly she started rewriting our marriage in her mind. Not violently, not cruelly, but with this subtle revision that made me question my own memories. She'd say things like we'd been more like roommates, even though 2 months earlier she'd pulled me into the shower for sex on a random Tuesday because she'd missed my hands on her. She'd claim we hadn't talked deeply in years, even though I could still remember late nights on the couch, her legs over mine, confessing fears she said she'd never told anyone. It wasn't that she was lying outright, it was that she was editing, deleting anything that didn't support the new story. I caught a glimpse of him again one afternoon when I went to drop off a box of her things she'd forgotten, and he opened the door of the apartment she'd moved into like he lived there, like he belonged there, while she stood behind him with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. He thanked me for being mature, said he respected me, said he hoped I'd find peace, and it was so polished it felt rehearsed, like he'd learned the language of decency without learning decency itself. When I asked him something simple, where he'd been living before this, why he had time to play house so suddenly, he laughed lightly and said, life was complicated, then turned the conversation toward how hard this must be for her, and she immediately softened, immediately mirrored his tone, and I watched it happen like I was watching someone get gently hypnotized. That night, sitting alone with the box still half unpacked in my hallway, I realized the missing details weren't accidental. They were the whole point. The vagueness, the polish, the alignment, the careful social media breadcrumbs, all of it created a world where questions sounded rude and doubt sounded like bitterness. And somewhere beneath the anger, beneath the grief, something colder began to form. The suspicion that if his life was this curated, if everything about him was designed to look flawless from a distance, then there was a reason he needed it to stay that way. And the closer my wife moved toward him, the more I started to wonder what exactly she wasn't being allowed to see. I didn't go looking for proof at first, not consciously, because part of me still wanted to believe that what I was seeing was just bitterness sharpening my perception, that I was filling in gaps with suspicion because that hurt less than accepting she'd chosen him freely and fully. But once doubt takes root, it doesn't need encouragement. It just needs silence. And in the quiet evenings alone, I found myself paying closer attention to details that had seemed irrelevant before. It started small, with timing, the way he was always available when she needed reassurance, but somehow never around when things required public acknowledgement, how weekends were spoken about in vague terms, how plans were always described as fluid, adjustable, private. One night, scrolling absently through social media, I noticed something odd. A tagged photo from an event he'd supposedly been at overseas the same week he'd helped her move into the apartment, and the caption didn't match the story she'd told me about why he'd been so exhausted that day. It wasn't dramatic, just inconsistent enough to make me pause, and I clicked through the profile of the person who posted it, a woman I didn't recognize, someone whose page wasn't public but not private either, filled with ordinary moments, dinners, trips, candid smiles. He appeared there more than once, never front and center, but present in reflections, in cropped shoulders, in comments that carried familiarity without romance, and something about it made my chest tighten. I told myself it was nothing, that people exist in overlapping social circles all the time. But then I noticed how carefully his own online presence avoided tagging anyone, how his photos were either solo or group shots where intimacy could be denied, how his captions spoke about freedom and focus and self-mastery without ever anchoring him to a specific place or person. It wasn't that he was hiding her, it was that he was hiding everyone. And that realization shifted something in me, because men who are truly free don't work that hard to look unclaimed. I started to map the edges of his life without crossing into it, piecing together patterns the way you do when you don't want to be obvious. I noticed how he'd disappear from my wife's posts for stretches of time, how her captions would turn more reflective, more insecure, then suddenly brighten again after a flurry of likes from his account. I noticed how certain holidays went unmentioned entirely, how there were no photos from family gatherings, no casual snapshots of shared domestic life, only curated moments that suggested intimacy without confirming it. It felt like watching a stage set from behind, seeing the supports and shadows that ruin the illusion once you know where to look. The confirmation came by accident, which somehow made it worse, because it meant I wasn't chasing a conspiracy. I'd simply stumbled into reality. I was at a bar near my office one evening, killing time before heading home, when I heard his voice from a table behind me. Unmistakable once you know it, carrying that same confident ease I'd seen at the cafe. I didn't turn around right away, didn't want to be seen, but I listened. And when I finally glanced over, I saw him leaning in toward a woman I'd never seen before, her hand resting on his arm with unconscious familiarity, the kind that comes from repetition, not novelty. They weren't hiding. They didn't need to. They looked like a couple who'd been together long enough to forget they were performing, laughing quietly, sharing food, arguing gently about something trivial. He brushed her hair back from her face without thinking, a gesture so intimate it made my stomach drop, because it was the same one he'd used on my wife in front of me, like a signature move. And in that moment, the last of my denial collapsed, because this wasn't overlap or ambiguity or misinterpretation. This was parallel lives running side by side. I left before they noticed me, heart pounding, thoughts racing, and walked for a long time without direction, replaying everything I'd seen, everything that suddenly made sense, the curated availability, the vague timelines, the insistence on privacy framed as maturity. He wasn't choosing between women, he was managing them, carefully, deliberately, feeding each one a version of himself designed to fit the story they wanted to believe. And my wife, for all her confidence and certainty, wasn't stepping into a clear future. She was stepping into a shadow, into a role already occupied by someone who had no idea she existed. That night, alone in the house that still smelled faintly like her, I didn't feel anger the way I expected to. What I felt was a slow, unsettling clarity, the understanding that this wasn't a simple betrayal with clean lines. It was something messier and quieter and far more revealing. There was a woman in the shadows of his life, unseen by my wife, and the knowledge of her changed everything, because for the first time since she walked out, I realized the story wasn't finished yet, and whatever came next wouldn't be about winning her back or getting revenge. It would be about bringing the truth into the light, whether any of us were ready for it or not. I didn't set out to meet her, which is probably why it happened the way it did, quiet and accidental and impossible to dismiss once it did, because coincidences only feel harmless until they line up too cleanly to ignore. It was a weekday afternoon, the kind that feels unfinished, and I was killing time in a small bookstore cafe near the bar where I'd seen him before, flipping through a book I had no intention of buying, when I heard his laugh again, unmistakable in its ease, and my body reacted before my mind did. I didn't turn right away, not out of fear, but out of instinct, the way you hesitate before touching a hot surface you already know will burn. When I finally looked up, he wasn't there, but she was, standing at the counter with a cup in her hand, scanning the room for a seat, and I recognized her immediately, not because I knew her, but because I'd already seen the outlines of her life without context. She had the same casual familiarity in her posture, the same unguarded expression I'd seen across from him at the bar, and when our eyes met, she smiled politely, the kind of smile you give a stranger when you're asking a silent question. I gestured to the empty chair at my table without thinking, and she thanked me, settling in with an ease that suggested she wasn't used to being on edge. We talked the way people do when they don't expect anything to come of it, about the bookshop, about the coffee, about nothing that mattered, and there was a warmth to her that surprised me, an openness that felt earned rather than performative. She mentioned she was waiting for someone, said it casually, not guarded, and when she said his name, my chest tightened in that familiar way, but I kept my face neutral, nodded like it meant nothing. She didn't know who I was, not yet, and that ignorance felt heavy in my hands, like something fragile I didn't want to drop too suddenly. She spoke about him with affection that sounded practiced in the best way, the way it does when you've been with someone long enough that admiration doesn't need embellishment. She talked about how busy he was, how private he liked to keep things, how he valued discretion because of his work, and every sentence aligned perfectly with the patterns I'd been circling for weeks. I asked how long they'd been together, gently, like it was small talk, and she said almost 2 years, smiling as she said it, because for her that number meant stability, commitment, proof. 2 years. The same length of time he'd been rewriting himself as single, available, nostalgic. The air between us changed subtly after that, not because I reacted, but because I felt the weight of what I now knew press against every word she said. And when she mentioned that he'd recently been helping a friend through a divorce, something in her tone shifted, just slightly, like a note that didn't quite belong. I asked a question then, careful and precise, about whether he'd ever talked about reconnecting with someone from his past, and she frowned, not suspiciously, but thoughtfully, and said no, not really, that he'd mentioned old college memories in passing but nothing significant, nothing that suggested unfinished business. That was the moment the truth surfaced, not with drama, but with devastating simplicity, because there was no overlap in our stories except the man at the center of them. And I could see it dawning on her too, the slow realization that something didn't add up. She asked me why I was asking, and I told her, not everything, but enough. Told her who I was and who my wife was, and why his name meant something different to me than it did to her. She went very still as I spoke, eyes fixed on the table, fingers tightening around her cup, and when she looked up again there was no anger yet, just shock and an almost clinical need for clarity. We compared timelines quietly, dates and trips and excuses lining up with unsettling precision, and the betrayal revealed itself not as a triangle, but as a duplication, the same emotional language deployed in 2 directions, carefully adjusted to suit the audience. She didn't cry, not then, and neither did I, because something about the symmetry of it robbed the moment of chaos, replacing it with a strange, sobering calm. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, and she said, "So he didn't choose either of us?" And I nodded, because that was the only honest answer. In that quiet cafe, between half-finished coffee and a conversation neither of us had expected to have, the illusion shattered completely, and I realized that whatever came next wouldn't be about taking something from him. It would be about deciding what to do with the truth now that it belonged to both of us. We didn't leave the cafe together in some dramatic, conspiratorial way, because nothing about that afternoon felt cinematic. It felt careful, like 2 people stepping onto unfamiliar ground and testing each step before committing their weight. We exchanged numbers with the kind of restraint that comes from understanding how volatile the information between us was, and when we parted, there was an unspoken agreement hanging in the air that this wasn't finished, that too many pieces fit together too cleanly to walk away pretending we hadn't seen them. I went home that night feeling strangely lighter, not because the situation was resolved, but because for the first time since my wife left, I wasn't alone inside the confusion. Our conversations picked up slowly, cautiously, at first just texts clarifying timelines, dates, locations, little factual anchors that helped us orient ourselves without spiraling into speculation. She would ask if he'd ever mentioned a trip somewhere, and I'd recognize it as a weekend my wife had described as a solo reset, and each overlap tightened the pattern, not dramatically, but relentlessly. There was no satisfaction in it, no thrill of being right, just a growing understanding that his version of honesty depended entirely on who was listening. The more we compared notes, the clearer it became that he hadn't improvised these lies. He'd refined them, reused them, adjusted tone and detail the way a practiced storyteller does. What surprised me was how quickly the edge softened between us, how outrage gave way to something steadier, more focused, because anger is exhausting when you share it, but clarity can be grounding. She wasn't interested in revenge, not in the dramatic sense, and neither was I, because revenge still centers the person who wronged you, and we were both too tired to keep orbiting him. What we wanted, though we didn't say it out loud at first, was control of the narrative he'd been managing so carefully. That required patience, not confrontation. There was tension between us, undeniable but restrained, not because either of us was looking for something physical, but because intimacy grows quickly when you're exchanging truths no one else has heard. She was intelligent, observant, warmer than I'd expected, and there were moments when I noticed the way she held eye contact, the way her voice softened when she laughed at something dry I said, and I was aware of the attraction without leaning into it, because it felt important not to let sex complicate something that needed to stay clean. Still, I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel it, that low hum of possibility that comes from being seen clearly in the middle of a mess. We decided, without ever calling it a plan, to let things continue exactly as they were on his end. No confrontations, no accusations, just observation. She agreed to keep responding as she always had, affectionate but not demanding, and I did the same, staying in limited contact with my wife under the pretense of sorting out practical details. It wasn't manipulation so much as allowing him to reveal himself fully, because people like him unravel best when they think they're still in control. We documented everything quietly, screenshots, dates, casual promises that contradicted each other when placed side by side, and the act of recording it felt less like building a case and more like reclaiming our own sanity. As weeks passed, the cracks began to show even without intervention. My wife started sounding uncertain on the phone, less assured, mentioning that he'd been stressed or busy, and I recognized those phrases instantly from my conversations with the woman he was hiding. He was stretching himself thinner, maintaining parallel emotional investments, and the strain was leaking through. She noticed it too, pointing out moments where his messages grew delayed, where explanations became recycled, and there was a grim symmetry in realizing we were receiving the same reassurances, delivered with slightly different packaging. What bound us together most wasn't the shared betrayal, but the shared restraint, the choice not to explode, not to rush toward resolution just to relieve the pressure. There was something quietly empowering about waiting, about watching him perform without realizing the audience had doubled. And in that waiting, in those late-night conversations where we debriefed the day and laughed softly at the absurdity of it all, I felt myself stabilizing in a way I hadn't expected. Because for the first time, the truth wasn't something I was chasing. It was something I was holding, and I wasn't holding it alone. By the time we acknowledged that what we were doing had become a plan, it had already been in motion for weeks, shaped less by intent than by momentum. Because once you start paying attention, lies have a way of documenting themselves. We never sat down and said, "Here's how we end this." But we did agree on what we wouldn't do. No confrontations fueled by adrenaline, no dramatic reveals designed to wound, no impulsive messages sent at 2 a.m. just to relieve pressure. If the truth was going to surface, it would do so on its own terms, complete and undeniable, not scattered by emotion. We kept our interactions with him unchanged, which turned out to be the hardest part, because it required us to inhabit a kind of emotional neutrality that felt unnatural at first. She continued to meet him when he was available, continued to accept the explanations for why availability came in irregular bursts, and I stayed in minimal contact with my wife, answering questions about paperwork, finances, the house, listening carefully to what she volunteered without asking for more. It was unsettling how easily he maintained both narratives, how smoothly he shifted tone depending on who he was speaking to, and that smoothness became the clearest evidence of all, because genuine people don't need to calibrate sincerity. We shared screenshots in a private folder, nothing dramatic, just messages that contradicted each other when laid side by side. Promises of future trips scheduled for the same weekend. explanations for late replies that couldn't coexist, casual references to being alone tonight, sent to two different people hours apart. The more we collected, the less it felt like we were exposing him, and the more it felt like we were archiving a pattern that had always been there. There was no rush, no countdown, just a quiet accumulation that made denial impossible. What surprised me most was how his confidence never wavered, even as the cracks widened. He reassured my wife when she voiced concerns, reframing her doubts as anxiety, reminding her how special their connection was, how rare it was to find someone who understood you so completely. He did the same with the woman he was hiding, validating her patience, praising her trust, subtly positioning himself as the victim of unreasonable expectations. Watching it unfold from both sides stripped the charm from it entirely, because manipulation loses its mystique once you can see the mechanics. As the weeks passed, my wife's certainty began to fray. She called more often, her tone less buoyant, asking questions she hadn't asked before, about where he was, about why plans kept shifting, about why intimacy suddenly felt conditional. I recognized the early stages of dissonance, the discomfort that comes when reality stops aligning with the story you've invested in, and I resisted the urge to push, because this part couldn't be forced. If she was going to see him clearly, it had to be because the illusion collapsed under its own weight, not because I dragged her toward the truth. The woman he was hiding noticed it too. She described moments when he seemed distracted, less attentive, when his reassurances felt recycled rather than responsive, and there was a grim symmetry in hearing the same emotional weather report from two different places. We talked about timing then, about how much longer we were willing to wait, and agreed that the plan wasn't about choosing the perfect moment. It was about allowing enough evidence to exist that when the truth emerged, it wouldn't be arguable. There was tension between us in those conversations, a quiet intensity born of shared focus and shared restraint, and I was aware of it without indulging it, aware that proximity and trust can blur lines quickly when sex and betrayal are already in the air. We kept it contained, respectful, because neither of us wanted to replace one confusion with another, and that restraint, too, felt like a kind of victory, proof that we were acting from clarity rather than impulse. By the time my wife admitted, hesitantly, that something felt off, that he wasn't quite who she thought he was, I knew we were close, not to an explosion, but to an unraveling. The plan didn't require a final act from us, just patience, documentation, and the willingness to let the truth finish what it had started. And as we waited, watching his confidence slowly outrun his control, I understood that the most effective exposure isn't loud, it's inevitable. I wasn't there when it happened, not physically, but I knew the moment it did, because the shift came through her voice before it came through her words, a quiet tremor underneath the controlled tone she'd been using for weeks, the sound of someone realizing the ground they'd been standing on wasn't solid after all. She called late, later than she usually did, and for a second I considered letting it go to voicemail, because I'd learned the value of space. But something told me this call was different, that whatever illusion she'd been clinging to had finally cracked beyond repair. She didn't start with accusations or explanations. She started with silence, a long pause on the line that made me wonder if she'd changed her mind. And then she asked me a question that cut straight to the point. "Did you know he was seeing someone else?" The words were careful, almost clinical, as if she were afraid that adding emotion might make the answer less real, and I took a breath before responding, because this was the moment we'd been waiting for without ever naming it. I told her the truth, simply, that yes, I did, and that I hadn't known at first, but once I did, it explained a lot of things that hadn't made sense before. She exhaled sharply, the sound halfway between a laugh and a sob, and said she'd found out on her own, not through snooping or confrontation, but through a series of small revelations that stacked up too neatly to ignore. A missed call that went unanswered for hours, a social media post she wasn't meant to see, quickly deleted but already burned into her mind, a conversation where his explanations looped back on themselves until they collapsed under their own weight. She said she'd recognized the pattern suddenly, the way he redirected discomfort, the way he framed her questions as insecurity, and once she saw it, She couldn't unsee it. What hurt her most, she admitted, wasn't that he'd been lying, but that she realized she'd never been chosen in the way she'd believed. She wasn't the exception, the rekindled love story, the past that finally got its happy ending. She was a convenient chapter, reopened because it fit his needs at the time. When she confronted him, she said she'd expected denial, maybe even remorse, but what she got was impatience. He didn't fight for her. He didn't apologize. He simply told her things were complicated, that she was overreacting, that maybe reconnecting had been a mistake after all. And in that moment, the fantasy collapsed completely. She told me how quickly he withdrew once she became inconvenient, how the warmth cooled into distance almost overnight, how the man who'd spoken about destiny and alignment suddenly spoke about boundaries and space. It was brutal in its efficiency, and as she described it, I could hear the disbelief in her voice, the shock of realizing she'd left one certainty for another that vanished the second it was challenged. She wasn't calling to ask for forgiveness or to come back. Not yet. She was calling because she needed someone who knew the full story to witness the moment it fell apart. I listened more than I spoke, because this wasn't about me proving anything, and when I did speak, I kept my voice steady, reminding her that what she was feeling wasn't weakness. It was the collision between belief and reality. She asked me how I'd known, how I'd seen through him, and I told her the truth, that I hadn't at first, that it took time, patterns, and the willingness to question a narrative that felt good to believe. There was a long pause after that, and then she said something that stayed with me. "I thought leaving meant I was choosing myself," she said quietly. "I didn't realize I was just stepping into someone else's control." When we hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, absorbing the strange mix of relief and sadness that came with her realization, because this was the second twist of the knife. Not for me, but for her. The understanding that the certainty she'd walked out with had been borrowed, not earned. Somewhere else, the woman he'd been hiding was reaching the same conclusion from the other side, and the symmetry of it felt almost surreal. The exposure we'd planned was no longer necessary in the way we'd imagined, because the truth had already begun doing its work, dismantling his carefully constructed world from the inside, one realization at a time. The moment finally arrived without ceremony, which felt appropriate, because nothing about what followed needed drama to be devastating. It wasn't a confrontation staged in public or a group message sent to burn everything down at once. It was quieter than that, deliberate, controlled, and impossible for him to spin once it was done. The woman he'd been hiding chose the setting, a small gathering he couldn't easily avoid without raising questions, a place where his two lives were always kept separate by design. She didn't announce anything when she arrived, didn't look for him immediately, just took her time, grounding herself in the room while he moved through it with his usual confidence, unaware that the ground beneath him was already gone. When she finally spoke to him, it wasn't loud enough to draw attention, just firm enough to demand it, and I watched from a distance as his posture shifted, shoulders tightening, smile faltering as she said his name in a way that stripped it of charm. She didn't accuse him right away, didn't list grievances or raise her voice. She simply asked him who my wife was to him, and the pause that followed stretched too long to be innocent. He laughed reflexively, the way people do when they think humor can dissolve tension. But she didn't join him, and that absence of participation changed the equation instantly. She laid out the facts calmly, dates, messages, overlapping promises, not as an attack but as a mirror. And I saw the color drain from his face as he realized how much of his careful balancing act had been mapped. People nearby began to notice then, not because of volume, but because of the shift in energy, the way confidence curdles when it's exposed. Someone asked what was going on, and before he could intervene, before he could redirect or minimize, she answered simply that she'd just learned she wasn't the only woman he'd been building a future with. The reaction wasn't explosive. It was worse for him than that. It was quiet judgment, the kind that settles in when there's nowhere left to hide. Questions followed, not aggressive, just curious, and every answer he attempted contradicted something already known. The image he'd cultivated couldn't survive daylight, because it depended on isolation, on each person believing they were the only one seeing behind the curtain. As the truth spread through the room in fragments, I realized he wasn't losing relationships in that moment. He was losing credibility, and for someone like him, that was everything. My wife wasn't there, but she didn't need to be. She'd already reached her own conclusion, already confronted him and been discarded for it, and watching this unfold without her involvement felt strangely fitting. She'd stepped out of the illusion before it collapsed publicly, spared the humiliation of being one of many spectators. The woman he'd been hiding didn't linger once she'd said what needed to be said. She didn't wait for apologies or explanations, didn't look back to see if he followed. She just left, head high, dignity intact, and that quiet exit carried more weight than any scene could have. I didn't approach him afterward. There was no satisfaction to be gained from watching him scramble, no closure waiting in his expression, just a hollow confusion as the narrative he'd controlled slipped out of reach. I left too, unnoticed, because my role in this had already ended. I hadn't needed to confront him, to demand acknowledgement or remorse, because the truth had done that work for me, dismantling his constructed world piece by piece without my intervention. As I walked away, I felt something settle that I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not revenge, but a steady sense of completion. The mask was gone. The story he'd sold had expired, and for the first time since my wife walked out with such certainty, I understood that the real resolution wasn't about what was revealed, it was about what I no longer needed to carry, the urge to explain, to compete, to prove. He'd been exposed, not by anger or confrontation, but by the simple act of no longer protecting his lies, and that felt like the cleanest ending possible. In the weeks that followed, the silence felt different from the one that came after my wife left, not hollow or disorienting, but deliberate, like the quiet that settles after a long illness finally breaks. There were no more urgent calls, no half-formed explanations drifting in and out of my life, no second-hand updates about him trying to repair the damage he'd caused. Whatever world he'd built had moved on without me, and for the first time, that didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like freedom. I returned to routines slowly, reclaiming the parts of my days that had been consumed by uncertainty, and with each ordinary moment I realized how much energy I'd been spending just trying to keep up with a story that was never meant to include me honestly. My wife and I spoke a few times after everything collapsed, not to reconcile, not to argue, but to close practical loops and acknowledge what had happened without rewriting it. She sounded quieter than before, stripped of the borrowed confidence she'd carried when she left, and there was a humility in her voice that hadn't been there in months. She admitted she'd mistaken certainty for strength, attention for depth, and familiarity for truth. And while I listened, I understood that her reckoning wasn't mine to manage. She wasn't asking to come back, and I wasn't offering, because whatever we'd been had ended the moment she chose a fantasy over the reality we'd built. The woman he'd been hiding reached out once more, not to relive the betrayal, but to say goodbye in a way that felt mutual and complete. There was gratitude there, not romantic, not possessive, just the quiet acknowledgement that clarity shared can be easier to bear than clarity faced alone. She told me she'd ended things cleanly, that she was rebuilding her sense of self without anyone else's narrative shaping it, and when we parted, there was no tension left unresolved, just a shared understanding that neither of us had been taken from anyone. We'd been released. I spent a lot of time reflecting on the idea that had followed me through all of this, the notion that I'd taken something from him, some kind of revenge prize that would balance the scales. But the truth settled differently once the dust cleared. I hadn't taken a woman, a relationship, or a future from him. I'd taken myself out of his reach. I'd stepped out of the comparison, the competition, the need to be chosen by someone who measured people by convenience rather than care. What stayed with me most wasn't the satisfaction of seeing his image unravel. It was the relief of realizing I didn't need it to. Watching him lose control over his narrative hadn't healed me. Understanding that I was never obligated to play a role in it had. The real shift came when I stopped framing the story around what was done to me and started seeing it for what it was, a collision of choices revealing character, not value. Life didn't transform overnight into something spectacular or poetic. It became quieter, steadier, more honest. I slept better. I laughed without checking my phone. I had sex again eventually, not as distraction or proof, but as connection, choosing partners who met me where I was rather than where they wanted me to stay. And in those moments of intimacy, I felt present in a way I hadn't in a long time, because I was no longer bracing for abandonment disguised as destiny. In the end, the question of who was really taken answered itself. He lost control. My wife lost an illusion. The woman he hid reclaimed her autonomy. And I gained something that no one could take from me again, the calm certainty that I don't need to be familiar to be chosen, and I don't need to compete for loyalty that should be freely given. The story didn't end with revenge or reunion. It ended with clarity, and that more than anything was what stayed.